So I want to welcome back those of you who want to attend the clinical breakout session. Hopefully you were on the earlier session today. To summarize that, we had a great discussion from a number of radiologists and imaging experts, as well as those working in the field to interpret what we see on the CT scan into clinically actionable items. And part of the reason for this workshop the last few years is to know that when we find early abnormalities related to possible COPD or interstitial lung disease, the ILAs that we're talking about, how do we put that in front of the clinician in a way that allows them to intervene, whether it's simply by increasing smoking cessation efforts, making sure healthy lifestyle is promoted with proper rest, exercise, weight management. And hopefully the day will come when we can utilize medications to modify lung disease. But in the meantime, we have to figure out how healthcare systems and physicians and radiologists can use all the information that they have available to them now with AI, looking at these scans and coming up with more and more findings aside from the cancer-related nodules. I think we have two individuals joining us this afternoon to give a perspective on that. The first one is Lee Gazorian from Leahy Clinic, and I want to introduce Lee and have him come on and tell us about his project in looking at something called the Before Symptoms company, which he is founding. I think it's really going to be interesting to a number of you as far as how this information can be put to use clinically. Lee, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thanks for having this breakout be at the end of the day. I'm on nights this week. So would you like me to just show a couple slides?
Yeah, why don't you explain what you're doing and the importance of the before symptoms findings that you.
Yeah, so what we're doing at Leahy is we have a lung health clinic that was supported by a grant from Three Lakes Foundation to basically start a population screening approach for interstitial lung abnormalities. Our clinic's been live since January. We're using natural language processing to screen all of our scans. We do 40,000 scans a year at Leahy, chest, abdomen. This could be caught on a neck, a thoracic scan. But we also did just recently, we piloted Embio's IQ-UIP algorithm, which detects UIP pattern in a yes or no binary fashion. And we have some really interesting results that I'd like to share with the group about how AI and technology can come to play in the future as we start building lung health clinics. I'm only going to show just a couple slides for the sake of time.
Okay.
I'll put through. I do have one disclosure. I did invent and Leahy trademarked an air lung report, which is a visual assessment of a patient's lungs with educational material that goes directly to the bedside to help patients understand their disease. So Leahy licensed the air trademark and they licensed it to Embio. This is the problem, just briefly. This was a real case of a patient who had a lung cancer resected from lung cancer screening in December of 2018. PFTs were abnormal, 75% predicted. He had probable UIP pattern on that scan. In April of 22, when he was identified, he had typical pattern. And the reporting of interstitial lung disease is really variable among radiologists. And this patient actually was never referred to pulmonary. I presented him at our last quantitative imaging workshop last year and said he was going to be the first person that we brought into the clinic. Unfortunately, he actually passed away from respiratory failure that month when I came back to pull up his chart. So I just want the program is going and we're actually intervening now. So it's been really positive. So I want to show you the Embio data. So we ran 3 months worth of scans, June through August. These are all non-contrast chest CTs, 2,837. The IQ-UIP algorithm had 121 positive hits where met threshold for UIP, probable or typical pattern. From that, I went through, this is just one blinded reader. We have another blinded reader who's scoring these, and then discordance will be reviewed by a thoracic radiologist. This is preliminary data, but 59 of the patients had probable UIP, typical or probable pattern. 11 were deemed indeterminate. 20 had an alternate UIP pattern, and there were 31 false positives. These were mostly lower lobe consolidation and pleural effusions. And then from that 59 UIP and 11 indeterminate, there were 69 unique patients. I mean, they only had one patient had 2 scans. So from that, 26 of the patients carried a diagnosis of IPF, 37%. 18 had undifferentiated ILD, 25%. 5 had another diagnosis. 16 did not carry a diagnosis, and that's 23%. And 4, about 6%, were not followed by pulmonary. Interestingly, 94% of these patients were under the care of pulmonary. And I think part of that reason is these are non-contrast chest CTs. The majority at Leahy are ordered by pulmonologists. So when we look at the scans itself, of those 59 positive scans, 18 reported UIP, the radiologist reported UIP pattern. So only 30% of the time they actually reported probable or typical UIP pattern. 25% of the time they described findings that would be consistent with UIP, such as subpleural reticulation, traction bronchiectasis, honeycombing, and a basilar predominance. So we were able to ascribe, yes, this meets criteria for probable or typical UIP. 8.9%, they didn't report ILA or any features of UIP. And 21 of the scans, they reported ILA features, but nothing that would allow you to say this was a typical or probable UIP pattern. And then from that 59 patients, we reviewed the clinical opportunity. There were 20 patients who were eligible at the time of the scan based on their diagnosis and their pulmonary function tests for antifibrotics, but were not offered, or they were in a watch and wait. There were 16 patients who were potentially eligible who were still under evaluation. That was 27%. 8.6% declined antifibrotics. 5 of the patients died or in hospice. And then 12 of the patients were currently on, or they had failed the treatment options. So there was a real large opportunity to change the approach of the management of patients, because it's varied on how providers are offering antifibrotics and treatment. And then all of these patients would be eligible for clinical trials. So I think this is it's a really nice, insightful view of how this technology can help us standardize care, and then also diagnose and identify patients in a standard fashion. So I'll stop there and I'll open up for questions.
Don't see any questions from the audience. Based on what you're finding, I guess the interpretation is that data coming from the radiologist is variable, as well as then the action taken by the referring physician seems to be variable as well. Is that too much of a...
That's the take we're having, and that's what we're finding. And when we read the clinical reads, it's really variable. The NLP process we're using it's kind of laborious. There's a lot of patients who the radiologists will report no interstitial lung disease, and we have a very primitive NLP that we're using, so those are being picked up. But when we read through the scans, there's a lot of variability on how this disease is reported. You know, when our thoracic radiologist, Dr. Thomas, reads these scans, it's, probable, typical UIP. It's a very standardized approach, but not everyone's a thoracic radiologist, right? And I think that's where this technology will really help the communities, sort of flagging to the radiologist, here's a case, you should think about UIP, and this is how we report it, right? I think that's the thing, is not everyone knows the guidelines and the reporting of this disease.
And I was chatting offline a little earlier, so we're seeing variation in the radiologist training and the specialty of the radiologist. But we also know that there could be changes and variations in the CT scan itself and what it's able to show based on the technique that's used to do the scan itself, as well as the specifics of the scan. Is that a fair analysis as well?
It is. And so from this data, I'm unable to tell you what the sensitivity is. We're going through all those scans that were picked up by NLP, so we'll be able to see how many false positives there were. But from the specificity, it's going to be very high. There were only 31 true false positives where there was no ILA. And this was the first time it's been implemented in a clinical setting. So with the ground truth, they can adjust and modify the algorithm to exclude those false positives. So it can only get better with time.
So I'm going to ask Dr. Mulshine to weigh in on what he's heard so far.
Yeah. Well, I think if you build it, they will come. And we're going to talk more about this, but one of the earlier presentations was from the chief medical officer of the American Cancer Society, Bill Dayhut, and he's saying with their revisions to the staging, the eligibility criteria for lung cancer screening, they're expecting a 35%, 37% increase in eligibility, and potentially as many as 19 million people in the screening population in the United States.
Yeah.
And that means for interstitial fibrosis, many other things, there's going to be a vastly increased amount of individuals that need very specialized attention because of the whole array of tobacco-related diseases that evolve. And so you're describing a tool which would be very important for potentially isolating a group of people for which, emerging therapy is now becoming a reality. And what we want to do up and down the line is create opportunities, whether they be behavioral modifications or pharmaceutical interventions, so that, people are not dying of these tobacco-related consequences, but they're actually able to manage them and have healthier lives. And so, Lee, if it's okay with you, I'd like to drop back and talk to another colleague who potentially has more information in terms of how is the system going to provide the flexibility to start reimbursing for these specialized services that are emerging from post-processing of the basic thoracic CT scan.
100%.
And to do that, we have Richard Frank, who presented last year about some of the emerging coding opportunities for AI tools. And this year he's been hard at work, and I think he can update us. And we can also press him at the end of his presentation. He knows I'm serious. Regard to these offerings like Lee is developing. How do we not deal with all these things as a one-off, but how do we actually systematize the rational management of the evolution of lung cancer screening across to tobacco screening to try to have a process where people understand what is going to be required to get into this workflow that allows for these products to be supported and innovation to be sustained. Is that too much to ask, Richard?
Well, I come prepared to be challenged like that because I've gotten to know you, and I think that's part of that provocation is why the Prevent Cancer Foundation and the quantitative imaging workshop is so valuable. But before I answer your question, let me congratulate Lee on a really excellent piece of software. And I have a question I'd like to put to you, but so that you understand I'm not being assertive, but instead being, shall we say, provocative in similar vein as Jim's. How do you see this fitting into the workflow? Is it something that might operate in the background, like sepsis software looking at every patient in the hospital? Is it something more like triage software that gets applied to every head CT looking for a bleed or a large vessel occlusion? Or instead, is it something which might establish the medical necessity by a physician specifically requesting it to be applied in lung cancer screening, for example, in such a way that that richness of data that we currently not only ignore but suppress because we think of it as incidental findings rather than important findings, that I'm concerned about, and this will kind of set the context for the comments that Jim has elicited for me. But how do you see your software fit in the workflow?
Yeah, I see the InBio software, just like all the 652 AI FDA approved algorithms that are already on the market. InBio is in the process of getting FDA cleared. They're a tool. They're a tool to identify lists of patients. But then once you have that list of patients, you need a system. You need a workflow, a clinical program, and a software to manage those patients. We're working on that. I've partnered with a navigation company, Caliper Health, and I've started a company, B4 Symptoms, to specifically design programs to manage patients at scale. Because if you find the patients, you still need a pathway to manage them. And what this technology can do is it can allow us to identify that list of patients and get them to the right specialists. I think that's really the key. It can be a flag to radiologists, but it can be a flag to the healthcare system saying, hey, here's your patient with marked calcium. Here's your patient with marked emphysema. Get them to the specialists that know how to manage those diseases, right? We take the burden off the primary cares. Because right now our system is designed to take patients from disease through primary care, who's the gatekeeper of sending those patients to the specialists. We need to augment that and help the primary care physicians identify the patients that there's technology and therapies that are out there for them. And that's where I think our system breaks down.
Well, and what you're describing, I'm just feeding back to you what I'm hearing. What you're describing is not so much like the simple workflow triage that CAD-T products provide, but instead is actually identifying and characterizing something in the image for the purpose of referring them to the appropriate specialist. And that's a very different thing.
Yes.
Simply prioritizing something in the workflow queue that was already going to the same physician. Yeah.
And the navigator, Jim, you've talked about this at last year's conference. The navigators are the key, right? The way I see the navigators, I see them as extensions of a patient's family that can take a patient from diagnosis all the way through treatment, so they're not getting lost to the system. Because that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing patients come in, they get lost to follow-up, whether it's incidental lung nodules, it's coronary calcium, come into the emergency room, you have a trauma scan that has calcium. No one's following up on that. It's buried in the body of the report, right? But if you have an AI system that finds it, gets it to a navigator who then helps you navigate through the system, that's what patients need, right? That's what I'm being told, that patients need help through the complex healthcare system.
Yes, and the conversations that I've had with people like David and Mort previously, and I'm sorry I missed Mort's plenary session this morning, so if anybody could educate me on that, I'd be grateful to know what the current status is. But you've mentioned just a couple examples of many actionable findings, including osteopenia, for example, and the vertebrae and so on, that right now are just being considered by CMS as nuisance because they're incidental findings rather than something which is actionable. So I'm really committed to helping to ensure that we get the maximum benefit from lung cancer screening, for example, and that the patients get the maximum benefit as well from what the AI has to offer. So I will now respond in a more substantial way to what David has asked me to do. He's cued me into. And do you see a slide?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to put it in theater mode. The first thing I have to say is that as a voting member of the CPT editorial panel, I am very much constrained to confidentiality. And there are various categories of access to this information. One can sign up ahead of time as an interested party and so on. But at this point, I'm restricted to addressing what has been put in the public domain by virtue of issuance of the summary of panel actions just in time for this meeting, in fact. And so what's in purple there, that limited disclosure, you'll see in more detail here in this purple box. This is a formal communication from the AMA, and you'll see here, you can read it for yourself, but it basically holds me and anyone else to confidentiality unless and until more detail is revealed about this. So I'm going to stick to what you see here, which I have cut and pasted the screenshot from the summary of panel of actions. And the main point for sharing this today is to show that we have made progress not only in adding an appendix to the CPT code set, which provides a framework for AI taxonomy to build CPT codes that are specific to the sort of product that Lee just described for us. But also we've begun to implement this, and I will be chairing a new group called the Digital Medicine Coding Committee with effect from the February meeting, so that we can begin to work for the rigorous and consistent application of the same kind of taxonomic rating of products in terms of what codes are generated. And you see in this particular code, which happened to be tab 57 in the last meeting, you see that the word augmentative was used. And I won't digress into the details of the specifics of that, except to say that augmentative means that the output from the software is useful to the physician in making care pathway decisions. That's fully validated, and the output can be used in and of itself, whether it's osteopenia information that may lead to treatment, or coronary calcification that might lead to the prescription for a statin or others. And that means that the output from the device has to be fully clinically validated, which can either be from a clinical trial that actually shows the role for that output in a care pathway leading to an improved outcome, or it can be by a high degree of correlation with another such parameter, which already is known to be useful. And one example of that is a fractional flow reserve from CT, which has been correlated very well with data from catheterization, and therefore also has the word augmentative in the final code, which will be issued. It'll become active 1st of January. That'll be 75580, fractional flow reserve. And so the clinical validation of that established it as an augmentative output. And I think the sort of thing that Lee was showing just now could also, when fully clinically validated, qualify for the use of this word. Now, Jim asked me about a broader range, and Lee mentioned a few examples. When the full code is published, and we can talk more about this, I think it would easily be seen that this code will lend itself to that. And therefore, the question I would put back to you, which is, how do you see the maturation of such programs as Lee's for each of the various things that, among ourselves, we might agree to call important findings rather than incidental findings, in such a way that there might be a suite of algorithms applied to lung cancer screening at the request of a physician, and therefore satisfying the clinical necessity, the medical necessity criterion of CMS, and therefore qualify for payment, which would warrant the creation of a code. So that's my question back to this group. How do you see the maturation of this suite of software to look at the various, shall we say, important findings?
Are you
I will stop
saying
sharing
something?
now.
Yeah, you got garbled. If you had just said another sentence, you were saying something about the suite of programs. How do we see those coming forward? Did you want to repeat that last sentence or two you just said?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry if it became garbled. I'm seizing this opportunity to learn from all of you. How do you see programs like Lee's, but applied to other important findings, whether it's cardiac pulmonary ratio, or aortic widening, or osteopenia, or coronary calcification, or ILD? How do you see those maturing, each of themselves, perhaps comprising a suite of software that could capture all of that from a single lung cancer screening CT?
Javier, did you raise your hand to answer that?
Not exactly to answer that. I wanted
Okay.
to make a comment, so I'll let somebody answer.
All right, I'll try to jump in. I think by putting I'll say the word burden, by putting the burden on the physician to order a specific suite, I think defeats the purpose a little bit about this massive number of people getting lung scans for cancer to have their incidental or important findings missed if their physician doesn't think about ordering that suite. In my mind, if the data can be obtained by doing the lung cancer screen, we should have that data available to use clinically without needing to worry about a reimbursement structure. I know we have reimbursement structures in this country different from European countries, but it does seem to add a burden saying, I want to order a suite. We're having trouble just getting people sent for lung cancer screening, period. And I'd hate to have another burden put in there to get the additional information that is already obtained by that scan. If that's an answer.
Well, more specifically, I was asking about the maturation of the individual elements of what might comprise a suite. Yeah, you're talking about a business model and so on, and I agree that's important. I think, however, if we carry your comments, pardon my use of the Latin, ad absurdum, we might find that all that is bundled with the software that was looking for the nodule in the first place, and therefore there's no supplemental payment, and therefore there's no incentive for people to do what Lee is doing.
Yeah. So this is the chicken and the egg. And I was on a call earlier the week with Ella Casaruni, and she was quite emphatic that, for the evolution of this to happen, if there's not financial incentives for innovators to get in, to do the work, to develop the data addressing medical necessity, that the type of opportunity that Lee just outlined is not going to happen. And so maybe if we take what Richard just said and potentially dichotomize this, and we have this fundamental issue that I think Al is very concerned about, that we're at 4 or 5% participation in lung cancer screening, and we have a tragedy. We have the ACS saying we want to get that to 19 million, and so we have those fundamental problems. But then the next layer of problems is that we have specific things to be done for lung cancer, potentially other lung parenchymal diseases, potentially cardiovascular diseases, and how do we evolve to have the tools to allow those people to be identified. And as Lee just said, it's not only identification, it's navigation, and it's a handoff to a referral or some other kind of intervention that is going to be routinely required. And we can do this one by one, and it could take forever. Or is there a way to get some kind of pre-competitive cooperation to do this stuff more systematically? Like for instance, we just had a big discussion about whether volumetrics is necessary in interpreting lung cancer screening scans. And I think that the vendors probably feel that volumetrics is very important, and they probably have tools that they're already working with. And the question becomes, is there a way that some kind of volumetric suite fulfills the characteristics that you're looking for, Richard, for volumetric analysis of coronary calcium, volumetric analysis of lung nodules, volumetric analysis of some aspect of emphysema. And that would be handled in a suite, and it would be more cohesive and more workflow adaptable than if we just did everything one by one by one by one. And I was talking to Al about this before. Every person that a vendor is selling a CT scanner to is probably part of an organization, whether it's community or academic or whatever, that has another CT scanner. And one may be GE, and one may be Siemens, and one may be Philips, and whatever. And the question is there a way of not having fragmentation up front? Is there some pre-competitive way to get together to talk about certain kinds of approaches to volumetric analysis that would be standardized so that interoperability in delivering screening services across the spectrum encountered in this country could be incentivized, because it's going to happen much quicker if it goes that way than if it just goes off into the chaos of one by one approvals. Is that too much of a pipeline? I see you smirking a little bit, Richard.
No. I was looking at questions in the chat, and I didn't mean to seem like I was smirking. No, not at all. I think that what you say is a necessary discussion, and I see there are a couple hands raised. Well, what I was smiling about was Lee's lab, because I have 2 yellows and a black, and I had to close the door to keep them out, because otherwise I have that same sort of loving natured dogs here. You might think that I'm some sort of case that requires a comfort dog. They're so attentive, but anyway, yeah, no, I love it.
Okay, I lost my train of thought here somehow. I don't know why.
No. Well, I see that David has his hand up, and also Javier still
Javier
had deferred his question from earlier.
Okay, David, we'll go to you first, and then go down the line.
Yes, thank you, Jim. I have a question. It does relate. You know, I appreciate what Jim said about this idea of a suite and a single reimbursement for a suite of products. But I think I would look at this very differently, or not very differently. I would look at this a little differently. There are some things that are kind of approved already, and I'll be specific. Osteoporosis, for example, that's got all the approvals. Now there's software that's considered equivalent to DEXA scanning, but you can't just simply apply that to the. You can use the software. You can get an osteoporosis scan on everybody, but you're not going to get reimbursed. Physician isn't ordering it, so you still have to do what Al was I'd say complaining, but adding to the burden. A physician would have to say, no, I want this, which, you know, in general, they're not programmed to do. This is something that's, you know, considered reasonable and already has the evidence. The type of cases that the example Lee gave, I think Medicare would say, well, you don't have the evidence yet. It's a wonderful tool. It's maybe got some kind of FDA approval, but it doesn't have the backing of and you know, and you could sort of break down a lot of these software products that are coming out with which are sort of approved, which have, you know, considered already to have the evidence to be used, and yet there's still no consistent way of how do we get reimbursed for this. So I'm just curious if you see a distinction between these two approaches for or 2 different categories for getting reimbursement.
Yeah. Well, let's keep going. Javier, you've been patient.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, and Lee and I have discussed this many times. It's not only in the screening world where we find the important lung findings, and I love that term, Richard. But you know, and there's so many CT scans, many more than what we're seeing in lung cancer screening that have these important lung findings, and for instance, lung nodules. I mean, and Bruce did a work where, you know, 60% of these are lost to follow-up. And by the way, we've confirmed this data at Mount Sinai, very preliminary data, but it's, you know, 50% of our lung nodules are followed up. So it's a much larger problem. So we shouldn't only, I know you're not doing that, but, you know, we shouldn't only focus on lung cancer screening CT scans, because it's a very large problem.
Bruce, do you want to get your?
You're muted, Bruce.
Sorry, thanks. And Jim, you had mentioned the issue of incentives, and we have, you know, clearly advancing technology, which means we also have aging technology, because any advancement, in effect, depreciates the older technology. So I'd like to take a vote of folks and say, if we who would support paying more for the various types of AI in the taxonomy that Richard identified in the last year's meeting, paying more for that and funding that by paying less for the more obsolete forms of technology, because that would appeal to CMS. It would create the incentive, and it would create the incentive for better patient care. So is that a proposition that anybody in this group would support? I'm curious, yes or no, and why?
Well, Bruce, let me just say real quickly. What you're outlining is robbing Peter to pay Paul because it's a zero-sum game. And paying Paul, we're clear on. What is the Peter that we're going to rob? Because I don't know the existing investment in some kind of service that we could stop doing because we're now going to want to do this.
Well, it's the value base. We have new technology that we think brings better value.
You're muted.
It's really quiet, Bruce. Yeah. That's
Someone
better.
did that to me. So it's the value-based concept that we have some improvements that are better value. And one of the principles of value-based design is you pay less for things that are of less value. And I think that's the way that in general, services, all kinds of services you can think of, last year's model car costs less than next year's model car.
Yeah, I'm with you on the concept. I don't see where last year's model car exists currently.
Well, it's the failure to use some of the so you make a new standard, which is the augmentative technology, and that's available to everybody. But if you don't use it, you get paid less.
Okay, sure. Okay,
And
Lee, go ahead, Bruce. I'm sorry.
Well, but the question is who would support that? We're in a healthcare toxicity world, and despite us paying more and more and more for healthcare, results are getting less and less. So I think it's the world we're in. Nobody is going to get more money without coming up with some pretty good value propositions.
Yeah. Okay, Lee?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And sort of adding to what Javier said, only 7.5% of our scans at Leahy are lung cancer screening. The most of our data from ILA, the vast majority of that's not recognized and not referred to a pulmonologist is non-screening scans. And I think the technology is going to play out that the algorithms that actually help the radiologist report, those will come to the top. But I'll give you an example. Coronary calcium, our radiologists get it right 97% of the time, right? So why do they need an algorithm to say it's mild, moderate, or marked, right? I think the bigger problem is they're reporting it and nothing is happening downstream. Right? These patients aren't getting cared for. And that's where the value proposition is. 70% of patients with emphysema on lung cancer screening scans have never had PFTs. 40% of them will have COPD, right? So I think it's if we take the data we have using NLP or AI technology, get those patients into a health program that works on smoking cessation, right? The value proposition is going to be to the healthcare systems. Make your patient, your population healthier. You're going to have less readmissions and less hospitalizations. And that's it. As we move towards a risk model, I'm hopeful that will come into play. And where the technology can help is if the insurers have access, right? If they know, Leahy, 10% of your scans have greater than 5% emphysema, we want to see 75% of those patients enrolled in smoking cessation. Right now, no one is putting money into smoking cessation. But if you're going to get a big penalty that's in the millions, you're going to put that effort in and you're going to pay for the smoking cessation nurses, right? I think that's the vision of how we change this. We use technology to find patients and get them into programs to risk reduce them.
Lee, I really like that idea. The majority of Medicare patients are either in Medicare Advantage or in ACO. And that's just growing. whether I like it or not, it's growing. And those organizations have the financial structures already in place to do exactly the sort of thing they describe.
And think about it from a COPD perspective. At Leahy, 50% of our patients are a risk model. And if you add the diagnosis of COPD to a patient, that patient, if it's a 71-year-old female with no comorbidities, you add COPD, the system gets another, I think it's $3,500 a year to manage that patient, right? So find those patients who have COPD early. That's where the healthcare systems will benefit. That's where the value for the institution to adopt this technology.
So,
Yeah.
so Lee, I think now you're talking, and this is a practical thing that operates within the evolving models of compensation.
Mhm.
Before we get too far into it, I think I want to step back and make sure that we don't miss the navigation component. Because one of the things that we've had consensus on for a number of years in this forum is the unsung value of the nurse navigator, or the navigator, whatever the orientation is. And we have 20% of the people who've gotten their first screen coming back for an annual repeat screen. We have a massive problem with compliance. And the models that you see that have addressed this successfully have all done that with nurse navigation. And now you're talking about another role for nurse navigation in terms of your COPD effector type of thing. Cardiovascular, obviously, there's opportunities. How do we develop this nurse navigation process in a more intentional way to be kind of a buffer that allows us to raise the tide for all boats relative to the enhanced services, kind of mandated through the evolution of more comprehensive screening?
Well, Jim, I can answer that question from a software standpoint, because we have a couple examples already for which there are codes and there are FDA cleared products. One of them is the triage software, which, as I mentioned earlier, is really only workflow prioritization. It's not actually a referral of a patient. And in fact, FDA have had to issue a letter to providers cautioning them not to overinterpret when a particular case is flagged up to them. It's only putting it at the top of the queue. It is not pointing to a large vessel occlusion, for example, and it's not even precluding, it's not even ruling out an occult bleed that might contraindicate the use of TPA, for example. So it still requires that a physician read that scan, even though it has not only done this prioritization, but what's called care coordination. And that's where the confusion comes in the CAD triage products, because it alerts not only the radiologist that they need to read this right away, it also alerts a qualified interventional radiologist or neurologist that they may have a case coming their way soon. And what was happening was the interventionalists and the medical doc were over-interpreting the fact that this showed up on their phone, and they were calling in orders for a patient whose scan hadn't even been seen yet by a radiologist. So we have to be careful with the triage and the prioritization, but it does have an element of the care coordination to which you're referring. At the other end of the spectrum, there's a code 92229, which is for diabetic retinopathy. That's a device that acquires an image of the retina and interprets that for mild to moderate retinopathy according to an already well-recognized scale, the EDTRS. And therefore, the output from that device is not the scan itself. It's not the score itself. The output from that device is a binary, either have this patient come back in 1 year for a repeat scan, or refer this patient to an ophthalmologist, an interventionalist, because they need to have intervention. And so that would be something which is very close to what you're describing, because it's, in this case, it's giving the output back to the physician who acquired it in the first place. It would be a short step to actually notify also the person downstream from that, whether it's a pulmonologist who ought to do a biopsy, or someone who ought to follow up with a DEXA scan or whatever that might be. So we do have fledgling examples of this in the software realm.
Yes, thank you.
Jim, if I could just jump on this, because this is, I think, relevant to the session tomorrow on HEDIS and STAR metrics, that the follow-up is not widely used in the quality metrics for ACOs and Medicare Advantage plans. However, it is used in a few cases. For example, the measure for osteoporosis is that a woman who has a osteoporotic fracture should be followed up with a DEXA scan within, I think it's 6 months. And that's worth real money to both ACOs and Medicare Advantage plans. I think that gets at Javier's comment about follow-up to pulmonary nodules. So that sort of measure, just like the risk score that Lee was talking about, would be a way to force the ACOs and the Medicare Advantage plans to make it happen. Because if they don't make it happen, they lose a lot of money.
Well,
okay.
and presumably it's in their interest to treat that patient with etidronate and avoid the compression fractures in the vertebra that might result otherwise. Yeah. So
Well,
yeah,
yes or no. I mean, there's the real advantage is the bonus payments that they earn or the risk scores they earn. The medical savings is harder to demonstrate. So,
Yeah, but so I want to get Al, your thoughts on navigation and how do we think about a more effective way to move that forward in terms of a facilitating tool for dealing with this greater load of screening that's coming down the pike.
Well, I think the good news is that there's legislation, hopefully, that Medicare or determination by Medicare that they will start paying for navigation. I don't know the specifics of what setting, but we know, as you mentioned earlier, navigation works, whether it's a nurse trained or medical technician trained. It's the communication that Lee was talking about, identifying the patients and making sure they follow through with what's recommended. Right now, there's too much volume of information coming to a referring primary care physician or specialist, and even radiologists have a lot of information coming to them. The pulmonary nodules that Lee mentioned, that patient may come into the ER and have a scan done because of trauma. The ER doc doesn't follow up on the nodule. The trauma surgeon doesn't follow up on the nodule. The hospitalist doesn't follow up on the nodule. When the primary care doctor sees them 2 or 3 months later, he doesn't even know a pulmonary nodule was found. So I think there are gaps in the system where things fall through the cracks. A nurse navigator armed with an AI tool that identifies all these processes on the scan will be able to follow up. That's,
and I agree.
first.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think Al's example of the ED is a very good one, but that shouldn't be the only environment. It's certainly much broader than that. And if the software, for the sake of care coordination, alerted somebody who had this as their primary role, i.e. a nurse navigator, it's much more likely to be effective.
Yeah.
but I'd point out that the setting up a system of rewards and penalties doesn't need AI and it doesn't need EMRs because existence of a pulmonary nodule is identified in claims with an ICD-10. So it's actually a dumb, simple process that we could put in place today with ACOs and MA plans. Let them figure out how to make it happen.
Is that true
Excellent.
of only nodules, or is it also true of some of these other important findings like osteoporosis and coronary calcification?
It's for sure it's true of pulmonary nodules because we did a paper on that. The other findings are, I think, would require changes in coding practices. That is, if it's not coded, it's not going to be found in this way.
Okay, David, you've been very patient. Yes.
Yeah, I still, I heard a lot of very interesting points here that were made. And I just want to kind of follow up on a few of them. Jim, you talked about Ella saying that unless there's reimbursement, uh, that reimbursement she's talking about is not that the hospital's going to get more money. It's that the radiologist department is going to get more money. I think there's a distinction here that the radiologists, when they're reading, are not so concerned that this patient may get into the system. If they're reading a scan and they're reporting all these things, they want to know that there's some reimbursement for it that goes directly to them. So that's just sort of a starting point, because it's different than, I recognize that it might be that we find patients that will have, interstitial fibrosis or whatever, and that becomes important for the institution, but it's not so important for the radiologist directly. That's one point, but I still haven't gotten a clear sense of there's a difference between identifying coronary calcium on a scan because that's not reimbursed. Medicare currently says we don't reimburse that. We don't think there's enough evidence to do it. Even something as basic as coronary calcium scoring. But osteoporosis, for example, there is. That's reimbursed, and that we could do. So I'm wondering, when you think, Richard, of whether we should get an additional supplemental fee if we somehow apply a software that reads osteoporosis, as opposed to, but there currently is no mechanism for directly billing it. You still need the referring physician to say, hey, you're doing a lung screening, but also look for osteoporosis. And I'll just, and I just tell you that osteoporosis is missed on the vast majority of lung cancer screening. I would say 95% of the osteoporosis is not called, it's there.
Well, and this is why my lead foot had to do with a suite or an ensemble of software, because I can see that on the one hand, it's at risk of being bundled with the nodule detection and there's no supplemental payment. But if instead you could put these together as a smokers panel, because we all know that smokers are at increased risk not only of lung cancer, but also of bone mineral density loss, also for calcification and so on and so on. I think it could be justified, and we'd have to persuade USPSTF. So, okay, when I say justified, I don't mean to say they're going to give a recommendation next week. But I think it could be justified that you would have a smokers panel. So just as now you have certain criteria for who qualifies for lung cancer screening, you have similar criteria for those who qualify for these other things.
But that gets to the idea then, and I think this is, you're hitting it. I love this idea of a smokers panel, and it fits with the idea if you're going to do the smokers panel, then you get reimbursed more for doing the whole smokers panel. And if you don't do it, you get reimbursed less. But then it gets to the question of how do you decide what's in that smokers panel? I mean, Lee showed some wonderful examples of how you could look at IPF, but maybe that doesn't meet the criteria yet.
Well, if only we had a registry.
Yeah.
If only we had a registry and we could go back and look at this.
So yeah, how do you get that kind of data? And could this be done, and Bruce is the master of this. Bruce, how do we get the kind of data to convince CMS that this is what's necessary? How do we get that? You're on mute, Bruce.
CMS, I think, responds to multiple kinds of data. The more different kinds of information, the better. And of course, they're always constantly bombarded by vendors who are trying to, sell their wares. So that, and it's very difficult for CMS to validate vendor data or randomized controlled trials, even with their own people. But it's easy for them to validate things that come across their administrative data, encounter data, or claims data. So I think demonstrating in those data, even though it's not incentivized, what portion of people, of the, 100,000 or so people getting lung scans, how many of them, have osteoporosis, I think, or diagnosed later.
So Bruce, let's just be clear for a second. Are you saying validated using their own data retrospectively? Or are you saying you have to do a coverage with evidence
No, no,
kind of,
no.
I
retrospectively, I
just
mean,
want to be
it's
clear.
it's a way to get the conversation. In my experience, it's not sufficient, but it gets the conversation going. It gets people accepting the results, so that it'll be easier
okay.
for them to accept other.
Okay, we got 5 minutes left. So Lee, your question, and then we're going to spend the balance of the time on action plans that we're going to bring forward tomorrow. Okay?
Jim, I just wanted to talk about the navigators. How do we get them? I know CMS reimburses, that's going to have a big impact because the biggest barrier right now, hospitals see navigators as a 4-letter word, right? Because they cost money and they don't see the financial benefits of it. I struggled to get one for our lung health and CDI program. We just got approval to hire somebody. And the way you show the hospital the benefit is by having the navigator finding those patients. You get the risk models by making sure they assist with coding and documentation. But then, for coronary calcium, yes, if someone has marked coronary calcium, if their LDL is 130, right, and they're actively smoking, and you get them to modify those 2 risk factors, you drop their 10-year cardiovascular risk score by 50%, right? That's real data. That's known, right? The coronary calcium is just a marker, as is the LDL and the other risk factors. So you need that navigator to find those high-risk patients, and then a percentage of them are going to flow through, found to have obstructive disease. They're going to go on to CABG and PCI, right? And that's going to be a financial win for the hospital. And then for the patients, they're not going to present with a stroke or a heart attack a couple of years later. So we got to show the hospitals the financial benefit of having the navigators, and don't think of them as a cost. Think of them as better patient care, savings for the hospital, and better outcomes.
Okay. We see some models of success in that regard. Because I agree with you.
I'm skeptical. But then the reason I'm skeptical is not that I absolutely agree nurse navigators, and the positives of that. That's the same issue with nurse staffing as a whole, which is a vastly bigger issue. And hospitals are, constraining their nurse staff spending. And so we're fighting a much bigger war there.
Okay. So the balance of the time, someone, and I think Al and I might have to arm wrestle about this, has to present this back to the full group as to what we think are the actionable things that will roll the boulder up the hill most effectively from the smorgasbord we just discussed. Okay, so who's going to rescue us? Rowena? That has some cohesive thoughts about what we do next.
Jim, I want to just say something that would bear on this. Tomorrow in the sessions, I think you're going to hear a lot of stuff, certainly in the session I'm doing where we're talking about designing clinical trials or for, it's really exactly towards this topic. And you're going to hear what Mort is doing in terms of approaching CMS and the struggles he's had. So I think this is going to bear on all of that tomorrow's conversation. I think Bruce's session will also bear on that.
Yes, but the pragmatic trials, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of people screened at places with comprehensive EHRs and stuff like that. How do we get some of that flow in which we have images and we have fairly comprehensive post-processing capabilities to read the scans, to go back and do the cross-rough to identify the kinds of targets that Lee just talked about that will be very important to the system in terms of its efficiency in a population health-based environment. Now, Bruce can be skeptical about it, and I appreciate if you can get it from administrative data, get it from administrative data. And you don't need AI to find hypertension, but where's the blend of innovation and better fundamental systems?
Well, Bruce doesn't need me to defend him, but I'd like to point out that he's not being cynical. He's being pragmatic. The reality is CMS do trust claims data. And one of the answers to this problem would be to enhance the making of claims. And I'll just point out that we've come full circle in this discussion now, because what I presented was a Category 3 code, the purpose of which is precisely tracking procedure volume. And so you may not get paid for that, but if what you want to do is generate the claims data as a basis for this sort of analysis, you could start using Category 3 codes.
Okay, I'm not sure I fully understand what that means, but I suspect we'll address this tomorrow. Thank you, Richard. I had hallucinated in a non-AI kind of way to say that vendors might pre-competitively cooperate on certain functions in terms of the screening analysis, so that various people could plug and play and be able to function at a center that has 3 or 4 different models of scanners, different software environments, this, that, and the other thing. And there might be some shared parameters or data structures or whatever to make that more efficient. Is it worth us trying to get those people in a room to say, hey, how do we figure out how to make this work the way the people that made portable computers cooperate, so that you could to actually get a tool that people wanted?
I think they figured out their strategy in that regard already. So to answer your question, I don't use the phrase fool's errand, but I do think it would be pushing a boulder uphill. I think they already have ways of working together. They've been developing software, hanging it on PAC system. They've done things cross-licensing. They're already pretty sophisticated in this regard. I don't think they would find this to be a new idea.
Okay. But Richard, how do we get this exercised, whatever those systems are, to handle this 19 million screening subjects that we hear is going to be coming down the pike with the enhanced accrual to screening? How do we bring that into action?
Well, I'm doing my part by trying to enable payment.
Is there something else that could be done?
I think we just let capitalism take over, honestly. You get device, pharma, all of those guys looking for, and then you have to have the affordable, the risk models where good care, better quality is reimbursed. And you let that play out. And I think that's going to be the answer.
Yeah, but where do you get the radiologists to read 6 million more CT scans?
Well, the technology can assist, right? So that's what we saw with IQUIP. It can help. What's easier, having the algorithm pick out and flag the ones that are high risk, or train every radiologist on Fleischner and ATS guidelines on how to score a scan, right?
No, I don't think that's the dichotomy. The dichotomy is radiologists don't want to do Fleischner. They want to do the most efficient way to do the medically required job. But there's not tools in workflow right now. Volumetric tools are not in workflow. There's no standardization about what volumetrics means, what the endpoint should be. There's lots of spade work that's not yet been done. David, you're much more expert in this than I certainly am. What do you think?
I think we should solve this all tomorrow, Jim. I think we're out of time.
Oh, we're 3 minutes over time.
Well,
Final comments? 1 more minute. Final comments. Richard.
Well, my wife has just been recruited to be the group vice president for the Columbia Hospital Network, and we're in the process of moving to New York. So my time is at a premium, including preparing dinner for the dean as she's on her way home. So I appreciate attention to the clock. My question is, tomorrow, I intend to participate or observe the session, Mort's session, and then participate in the discussion at the end of the day. Is that what I should focus on tomorrow?
Yeah, and Richard, I think that your contribution to the session that Mort is going to be involved in, designing clinical trial, et cetera, would be very useful. And if you're in the audience, I may, because I'm moderating that session, I may call on you, as well as Bruce will be in that session.
All right. Yeah, I have a conflict for that time. That's why I'm asking you to help me prioritize. I'm joking about making dinner for the dean wife of mine, but we all have those situations. Yeah, thank you.
But we're glad you're moving to New York.
We've looked cheap. We got a place in Bronxville already. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much. In the absence of burning final comments, thank you all for this. This is hard work, and we'll look forward to miraculous production of all the answers tomorrow. Have
Thank you,
great
everyone.
nights.
That's
Cheers.
asset based. Yep. Good night.
Good night.